We are honored today to welcome Attorney Abre Conner, the Director of the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. There, she oversees the strategy and collaboration across the NAACP to dismantle environmental racism. During this session, Attorney Conner will share her extensive experience advocating for environmental justice, health equity, and the social determinants of health at the local, state, and national levels. Rather than using our time to provide a further description of her impressive work, we are placing a link to her bio in the chat. The general format for today's webinar will be one 40-minute presentation followed by questions and answers from our audience. We ask that you put comments, links to any resources that you may recommend, or any questions that you may have for the presenter in the chat box at any time during this presentation. We will get to as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A period. Please remember to keep yourself muted so we are not interrupted by background noise. Ms. Conner, you may begin.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'm so happy to be doing this presentation with you all. It looks like, I'm not sure if my internet is acting up a little bit. It seems like it might be, but hopefully it's caught up properly now. But I'm happy to be doing this conversation with you all about something that's near and dear to me, which is how we utilize an intersectional approach to environmental and climate justice work. And for me, as someone, and I'll talk a little bit about this as I talk about my background, but I came to this work from a civil rights lens and then began to better understand the health intersection, as well as what all of that means for what we consider a definition of environmental and climate justice. So next slide. All right. So we have had for some time, we have understood that we are in the midst of a climate crisis. And oftentimes when there are conversations around the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis that we're in, um, I think because this moment highlights the need for us to talk about it with a sense of urgency, that sometimes it's not that clear that this really is one of our last chances at getting this right. Um, Even prior to this administration, who has continued to try to set us back even further, we were already off track when it was related to us being able to reach our goals globally as well as domestically to limit global warming. The concentration of greenhouse gases across the world is directly linked to the average global temperature, and there's no clear phase out. And even during previous administrations, we had done a lot of advocacy just to get the administration to say, okay, we'll at least adopt a framework, a fossil fuel wind down, potentially moving towards fossil fuel phase out. And Black communities are more likely to flood in the future because of these decisions. And as I'll talk a little bit about in my presentation, this has a lot of health impacts when we think about what flooding does, water contamination, water infrastructure, as well as the impacts of people being able to move forward and move past a disaster. And I call them climate disasters that are happening in our communities. Additionally, extreme heat, because of these climate-related disasters, are impacting many of us across the country. So if it's not raining and a hurricane or a flood, there's extreme heat or a wildfire that's happening in many of our communities. Um, if we have water shortages and water infrastructure issues, that impacts a number of interconnected issues, including our food supply, people's health more generally, and then overall ecosystem. And the United States, as it sits now, these numbers are actually probably a lot higher within the last few months, but because of how this administration has tried to phase out as much climate related data as possible, we're utilizing the information that we have and trying to track trends based on when we had a federal government that actually tracked climate related data. But that we were already 40% more likely than the world to actually contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So, this is a very urgent topic that we're talking about now. And I'm so excited that you all recognize the intersection of this work. So, next slide. So, the history of environmental racism is important for this conversation and my path and why I approach this work from a civil rights perspective. The person who is in this picture with me is Charles Lee. He was actually one of the authors of the report Toxic Waste and Race that was written back in 1987. This was one of the first reports that amplified that in addition to the citing of industrial sites based on things such as economic backgrounds of where people live, that race was the number one predicting factor as to whether or not there was going to be an industrial siting of pollution in a community. And so back in 1987, they were able to track that information. And oftentimes, when we think about environmental justice or environmental issues, um, there is the people sometimes want to move to a place of saying, well, all of these different factors impact, this idea of environmental justice. And that is true, but race is still the number one predicting factor. They did the same study 20 years later, toxic waste and race at 20, and they found the same thing. And actually, the numbers increased for the number of people who were impacted by industrial siting of pollution in facilities in communities. Race was the number one predicting factor. So, communities of color, again, are most likely to be living in places where there has been long-standing pollution and industrial siting of that pollution in their community. And then in Warren County, at the same time, around the same time, that was a historically Black community who learned about a landfill that they were hoping to put there with illegal based on illegal dumping of PCBs in their community because they figured that the people in Warren County would not care about this pollution that would then be added to their community. And that was one of the first times that we saw at a national level this issue that had been considered for just an environmental issue, just an issue that people in the conservation space cared about, to people dealing with environmental justice. There wasn't even really a term for it then. They just knew that these environmental issues were impacting Black communities and communities of color, and that there needed to be an intersectional approach to how these types of actions were happening. And so the NAACP, along with a number of other organizations, civil rights and other organizations at the time, stood with the community. And Dr. Ben Chavis helped to coin the term of environmental racism at that time. And so that was when the connection really started to happen between that, the Toxic Waste and Race report, and a few other reports that came out around that time for people to really understand the mobilization and organizing work around environmental justice. That was one of the first times we're seeing an intersectional approach that were connecting those issues. And then in 1991, there was the first National People of Color Leadership Summit, and they developed the 17 principles of environmental justice. And that was one of the first time that people across the country who were doing these very segmented fights around environmental issues that they knew had some type of other intersection, that they were coming together and they were like, wow, you're dealing with the same type of issue in your community. And they were able to talk to other folks and recognize that these were highly local fights, but they had a national scale to the impact of what was happening. And those guiding principles were the EJ principles were developed at that time, and that helped people to kind of understand how they should approach environmental justice work moving forward. And then the last thing that's worth mentioning, just for until I get into the next phase, is that there was also an approach at the federal government level to ensure that environmental justice for the first time was a part of how the White House and federal agencies were thinking about this issue more interconnectedly. And so, Executive Order 12898 was signed in 1994. And for the last several decades, that order has been in place. And as some people may know, for the first time, we had an administration who tried to repeal this executive order, which is, one of the landmark executive orders around environmental justice. But we know that that does not stop the work, especially now that people better understand that environmental justice and environmental and climate justice issues needs to have an approach that has a policy lens, an organizing and mobilizing lens, a litigation lens, as well as all the other components to ensure that communities get the help that they need. Next slide. So, one of the key components around environmental and climate justice work is recognizing that environment and conservation work is about creating a bedrock or a structure where everyone is supposedly able to have access to clean water, clean air, um, ensuring that industrial pollution does not come to their communities. But environmental justice is about recognizing that at the same time that the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, many of the environmental statutes were being created and being implemented across the country, that we also had a rise of NIMBYism, which is not in my own backyard. And that those two things together meant that there was a foundational kind of development of the structure of environment and conservation laws and the implementation of those laws that kept communities of color from being able to access those protections. And so while we were understanding the organizing, the policy framework, there was also this burgeoning need to recognize that there needed to be a legal kind of framework that was being built out that allowed for people to understand that some of our other laws, our civil rights protections at the same time, needed to be interwoven into the traditional environmental laws, and environmental framework so that people could also have access to the protections that are available and supposedly available to everyone, to be able to potentially file lawsuits and to be able to file administrative actions, in order for everyone to have access to environmental protections. Next slide. So this brings me to my background. Um, so when I started, when I graduated from college, I knew I went to, well, I'll actually start back a little bit further than that. I grew up in Florida, and when I grew up, I had a bunch of breathing problems. and I had an albuterol pump. And I thought it was normal to just have an albuterol pump that you needed to use in order to just, uh, engage in everyday activities. I had no idea that it was likely I had that albuterol pump because I lived near a bunch of phosphate plants in my community, and that was directly impacting my respiratory functions and how I was able to engage in the world. Intersectionally as well, I grew up in a rural part of Florida, in the central part of Florida, where there were a number of other issues that were showing up. Black students were facing issues that we still see, for example, around being disproportionately suspended or reprimanded in schools, that we had seen a number of police brutality issues that were happening. And so all of those types of issues led me to want to do civil rights work. Because again, at that time, I didn't fully understand that my albuterol pump was tied to environment and tied to the environmental justice component. But I knew that there were things that were wrong in my community and I wanted to go change them. And so I went to law school thinking, well, I'll go to law school, I'll become a civil rights lawyer, maybe I'll even go into Congress and I'll just fix the laws and that'll be that. And when I got to law school, I realized that um, there was this connection to the environment in the civil rights space that needed to be further explored, that I wanted to further explore. And I took environmental law, I took critical race theory, I wrote my critical race theory paper on the intersection of environmental justice and fair housing laws and how some of the statutes within the housing space could potentially be utilized if we weren't able to use traditional civil rights statutes to advance environmental justice work. And that was my introduction to recognizing that intersection at that point. And so it wasn't necessarily like I grew up thinking like, oh, I think I want to be an environmental lawyer. I came to that space from a civil rights lens. And then I did some work on Capitol Hill, and that's when I started to understand the importance of the organizing perspective, actually, because I would see people who would come into, and I was working in a personal office, they would come into our office, they would come in very organized, and that was what caught the attention of the member who I was working for, was when people were coming in, showing up, bringing up the issues that they felt were most important, and those issues got elevated to the top of the list. And I was really curious about better understanding the full breadth of how the federal government works. So I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked for a committee in the Senate Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee. And then I worked for some federal agencies. I worked for U.S. Department of Education, their Office of Civil Rights, to understand how that worked and their equal employment opportunity services. And then I worked for the White House as well in the Obama administration to understand the executive branch and how things maneuvered from Congress to the um, executive branch, as well as the legal Supreme Court, like that judiciary type of branch as well. And so when I graduated, I went and worked for an organization in West Harlem that was focusing on environmental justice issues. And I was like, okay, I think I, kind of understand how these areas work. And I think I just want to apply that in the community group perspective. And what I realized at that time, because there weren't a lot of EJ types of jobs that existed at all, was that a lot of folks were developing the plans in real time, and that a lot of those organizations really could just use any help that was offered to them from people who understood the issue, and would be able to help move forward the strategies that they had already developed. And so that was really illustrative for me, being able to work in an organization right out of law school, and they were like, "You are our legal help. So please tell us what to do." And so I didn't feel fully qualified to do that, but I did my best. And then I went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I was working on Supreme Court litigation and advocacy, appellate court litigation and advocacy, as well as some congressional work as well. And that was helpful just to understand the process of how cases would potentially move. What are some of the considerations, even if you're going to bring a case at a state or at a district court level, at the lowest court levels, what can be the implications if it shows up at the Supreme Court? So I worked on the Fisher v. Texas case and the Shelby County v. Holder case. And it was just helpful to see what an organizing effort, even around legal work, looked like. But I wanted to get back into the community lawyering, movement lawyering space. I moved to California, and I was working with migrant farm workers in the Central Valley of California at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. And so the picture that you see on the left with caps, that was some of the work that I was doing with uh, organizers around banning chlorpyrifos, and ensuring that there were more regulations around pesticides in the state of California. What I learned in that experience was that even though I was doing some traditional legal work, that my background had not fully prepared me to be a community lawyer or movement lawyer, and to show up in a way where I was listening to the community and they were giving me feedback, and then I was able to help them on the issues that they were most concerned about. And in law school, it's not necessarily a lot of preparation around that. I imagine it's probably somewhat similar in the medical space as well. But there is, for a lot of community organizations, if you show up with a spirit of, wanting to learn and humility, that goes a long way. And they do can definitely use the help of a lot of different organizations, and individuals who have expertise. One of the things that happened while I was at the community, the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, is that we would file these cases sometimes against really big uh, oil and gas companies, and we would oftentimes need, for example, expert testimony or reports from folks, for example, who are in the medical space. And that was one of the first places that I recognized, okay, this intersection of the health piece is really critical to environmental justice lawyers and organizations to be able to be successful. I also recognized that having sources was useful, and I moved to the ACLU after that so that we were able to expand the area of the region that I was working on, and then moved to Sacramento to open up our litigation office there. And then I moved to the Law Foundation in Silicon Valley with that background, again, for purposes of this conversation, of recognizing that health is a critical component of this work. And I led our health program at the Law Foundation in Silicon Valley, and I transformed it from just a traditional health program to understanding that the social determinants of health were an important part of doing that work. So we had the traditional medical legal partnerships, um, but I was able to restructure our MLP to have the MLP include additional questions, so that we could get to the foundational problems that we were seeing show up in the communities, to have a more holistic approach. For example, when, doctors were asking questions, we would add some of those foundational questions on the front end so we could figure out okay, is there something in the soil or something in the water that we can also use to potentially also think about other legal remedies to the problems that you're seeing on the back end? Um, and so that was really a useful opportunity to think about how very directly in the medical kind of environmental justice space where there are more opportunities to develop out those types of partnerships. Then I moved to the NAACP, um, and, and I brought all those different um, experiences to leading our National Center for Environmental and Climate Justice. And we take this intersectional approach to the work. And next slide. Oop. So as I highlighted, these are hyper-local initiatives with scalable impacts. This is a slide which I'm not going to go too much in depth into, but um, when there was a train derailment, for example, that happened in East Palestine, Ohio, we were able to go meet with Tom Roberts, who's the state conference president there, actually see what was happening, and then figure out what's a framework. So this is an example of how we did a hyperlocal um, case with a scalable impact. So in Jackson, Mississippi, many people may have heard about the water crisis that happened there a few years ago. And one of the things that people may not have known was at the beginning of when that water crisis happened, there was a lot of conversation, even at a local level, about who actually held the ability to change the water problems that were happening. And the state was really leading kind of the conversation, leading a lot of the public relations work and saying it was the mayor. The mayor had the ability to fix the water issues, and the Black people who were in Jackson, because Jackson is a predominantly Black city and capital, of course, of Mississippi, that they were mismanaging funds, and that's why there was a water crisis. But when we were having conversations with former mayors, and when we were having conversations with some of the folks who were historians in Jackson, it was really clear that the residents and the elected officials at a local level and others, that they had been asking the state for a number of years to give them additional resources for the water issues that they knew were going to come and that eventually did come to fruition. And so former Mayor Harvey Johnson, he had written a letter, for example, to the state years prior, asking them to give them more resources so they could replace the piping because they knew that it was not going to be able to withstand, for example, extreme heat and extreme cold for a lot longer. The state, of course, ignored those requests. And so then we ended up with the water crisis. And what some folks may not know also is that in a place like Mississippi, the state in general gets most of its money from the federal government. The state is not actually generating that much money. And so issues like this, it's hyper local, but there's federal impacts. And then also in a lot of these states where, they voted for our current president, they rely heavily on the federal government, which is just so ironic to me. Um, and so they, so people, once we started public education campaigns with the residents locally and understanding like what the issues were, people were saying things like they didn't understand fully what a water infrastructure system. So then we decided to file a civil rights complaint against the state, basically saying that you took this money from the federal government, which means that you have to abide by civil rights laws as it relates to water infrastructure, environmental issues, and that you're intentionally discriminating against this Black community by not giving them the money that they need in order to fix their water issues. But then at the same time, they were giving money to other communities that have fewer Black folks in them for water issues that weren't even necessarily as dire as what was happening in Jackson. Um, and that even if they were giving some money to the residents of Jackson, it was so small proportionately to what other cities were getting. And so our argument was that if you look at the proportionality of the amount of money that Jackson may have gotten, if you have the largest, um, you know, if you have one of the largest cities in the state and you're serving more people, then you should have more money to fix water issues. You shouldn't have the same amount as a city that has, a tenth of the population. Like you all should not be getting the same amount of money. Obviously, they should get more. So that's the justice component of it. And we felt strong about that argument at the time. We had a different administration. They had just opened up an Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency, and that was part of our efforts. We also did testimony in front of Congress, in front of the Committee on Homeland Security with Congressman Benny Thompson and others to highlight the need for Congress to give money directly to the localities as opposed to just going to the states. And we were able to get $600 million to be allocated to the residents of Jackson for their water issues. And we were able to highlight, that there is supposed to be this process that exists with the federal government to fix civil rights issues that intersect in the environment and climate space. At the same time, the people in Louisiana and their state government decided that they wanted to fight back against the EPA for allowing for the community to be more involved in these types of complaints. And so they filed a case against the EPA saying, we don't think that you should be able to allow for the community to be involved. It should just be us at the agency level, and it should be us talking to you all at federal government level. And for a number of reasons, there were people who had, they felt that they did not want to move forward with that fight. And so they retracted some of the decisions that were made on the Louisiana side, but then that argument was used in other places, like in Mississippi, and it was, it created a much harder atmosphere for people to move forward with these types of civil rights complaints that are like federal civil rights complaints. And so there's a question that I can answer in real time right now around accepting money and if it that makes it harder for the community to be able to get um, money or resources. So Congress has its own pot of money that it can always give to that it can always utilize to help communities across the country, right? Because that's taxpayer dollars, like that, those like it's money that's been allocated to help the community and people there. That's different, for example, than a settlement. So if, for example, there was a lawsuit that was filed in court, and then the community, for example, if it's a class action or something like that, if people were to accept money in that type of situation, that can sometimes impact the claims that might be available later on. But Congress allocating money does not necessarily impact the ability to file a lawsuit, for example, against the people who were doing the harm in the first place. Because even if Congress decides to allocate money, that doesn't necessarily mean that if, for example, a state agency did something wrong, that that's going to keep them from not doing anything wrong in the future. So that's what like the hook is the party is the, the entity who did the wrong thing will the money that comes from that, does that impact their likelihood of doing something wrong in the future? And in that situation, no, right? Congress allocating money does not mean that the state agencies are any less likely to allocate money away from Jackson. And so there would always be the ability to bring a case um, on that. So we um, got an interesting decision from the EPA, basically saying they're not saying that there wasn't discrimination, but they don't have the database to prove that there is discrimination. And an administrative case like what we filed um, is one where you don't, in theory, have to even be a lawyer to use. So anybody can file an administrative complaint with a federal agency and say, hey, this person who's taking money from the federal government, they've done something wrong, and we'd like for you to look into it. But the way that a lot of those cases have moved forward um, does unfortunately oftentimes require someone who has a legal background to make sure that they've sent enough information. And our argument and our stance has always been that should not be the case. But that is unfortunately how things have moved forward. But we brought a lot of attention to the issue. We helped to reframe the narrative around who actually is the problem. It made it a major impact for the elections and people understanding who actually had the power to make those changes. And we're able to get $600 million allocated initially. And then there were additional investments, for example, from the EPA later by making the announcement in some of the largest investments in clean and renewable energy into the city, even a couple years after their finding. And so it was hyper local, but there was scalable impact to that decision. Next slide. Okay. So I kind of talked a little bit about this, so I'm not going to go through it again. But basically, what this slide highlighted, I wanted to highlight here, was this was one of the last times where the federal government demonstrated that we are all in the midst of a climate crisis. Federal government, for a while, actually, um, did these national climate assessments, and the last one that the federal government has done highlighted that Black communities were more likely to face flooding. And that is the work that in the past the federal government has done as it relates to this. So next slide. Okay. However, we're in a place now where the advocacy and what that looks like has changed. We're seeing a repeal of a lot of clean energy initiatives, executive orders around this work. The slide that I showed before, I was highlighting kind of what the work has looked like to, really ensure that we have data, statistics, different resources to demonstrate the climate crisis that we're in, the number of disasters that we're likely going to face, the severity, the frequency of them. And now we have an administration that has 180 FEMA staff who have shared that if they don't get additional resources, that we're heading 20 years prior to what we saw during the time when Katrina hit 20 years ago. Next slide. And so we, this is a picture from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. This is with Marsha Fudge, who was one of the first agency officials who understood how HUD, for example, should be better connected to environmental climate justice space, but then also their role. more directly when it comes to disaster resiliency. And I won't go into all of it because I know we don't have as much time, but all to say that at that time we had federal officials who were showing up with communities, who recognized that their role of ensuring that, they played a role in climate resiliency, that was really important. And that's a lot of the work that I do now is, and at that time it was more with federal officials, to ensure that the framework made sense from a community level. And next slide. But what we have recognized is that we have to create a framework that is more locally based, that comes from a mutual aid kind of perspective, and ensuring that communities have the resources that they need now. So we actually just released this report, Power in the Storm. And so it's a people's response to the federal policy changes, as it relates to climate related disasters, and how the community can better be equipped and prepared for more frequent and severe disasters in the future, because we can't necessarily just point people to FEMA or the EPA or, for sure, HHS, and some of the other agencies that we have relied on in the past. And it's not to say that things won't change, but for the time being, um, part of my work is ensuring that people have a framework from our branch and our state conference perspective and our partners that they can utilize right now. Next slide. So this also plays out in how we're looking at emerging issues. So this is a slide that highlights the work that we're doing currently around data centers, where there's an emerging environmental and climate justice area where we need an intersectional approach to what that looks like. So I know, particularly within other spaces where folks are talking about AI, they're really just talking about AI at the end, but not necessarily thinking about how the AI is generated, the infrastructure that is needed in order to ensure that that's not creating more of a burden on communities. So a lot of the data centers that are being built in communities in order to power AI use a large amount of electricity. They are leading to more air quality issues. They're leading to water quality issues. In Memphis, uh, Elon Musk started XAI that would basically have over 30 unregulated gas turbines, that methane gas turbines, that was powering this data center near Boxtown, which is a historically Black community. And that, type of framework, unfortunately, is not something that we're just seeing in South Memphis, but he's also planning to expand that type of framework into places like South Haven, Mississippi. And then in other places in the country, we're also seeing data centers that are being built out that are using an extreme amount of electricity and the grid, or either utilizing a ton of water. And again, of course, utilizing a lot of existing facilities that utilize gas and other fossil fuels in order to actually operate these data centers. So we came together a few weeks ago and we built out the frontline framework. And the picture that you see on the right shows that we had folks there in person, in at Lemoyne Owen, but we also had people fully virtual who are participating in developing out guiding principles around data centers and the build out and engagement moving forward. And we are working with, for example, Representative Pearson, who is a local representative who has a national platform, but recognizing that there are other ways that we can still do policy work that of course, utilizes our federal kind of strategies, but also recognize that there's a state and a local um, alignment that we can have to allow for us to still be successful. The last thing I want to kind of highlight, and it is around all of the work that I kind of shared previously, but then also relating to the data centers as well, is that there is a need, especially I'd say in the data center conversation, um, around ensuring that there's more intersectionality within the medical community. So, because a lot of these data centers are coming online so quickly, and the conversations around being able to have strong community benefit agreements that exist, or to have a negotiating space to be in of people understanding the health impacts of, having gas turbines operating 24 hours a day in a community. Those are the types of places where, the intersectionality of the work within environment and climate justice, as well as in the medical space, that is super clear and is going to be super needed. Um, I talked about, water issues, but then, as I said, in the clean energy space, we are going to need for there to be more unity as it relates to this work. And so I wanted to just talk through five takeaways from the presentation today. One, that environmental justice is an inherently local issue. And so it's something that, people can get involved in. You don't have to do work at a national level to do EJ work. You can get involved in your community because that's honestly the best place that you can be involved in order to really dig into what's happening and be able to make those scalable impacts. It's also a racial justice issue. We talked about, the toxic waste and toxic waste and race at 20. That it must have an intersectional lens, right? And so it's important to recognize that EJ is a collection of the recognition that there must be a holistic and comprehensive approach to how we look at our environment. Um, and that, it's important to check power dynamics and decision making. But that we need everyone's help, right? As someone who was coming from a legal background, in law school, you're taught like you went to law school and you know the law, and so you can go into conversations with clients and be like, this is the path forward because you're the lawyer. And that is not the way to approach like EJ work, right? It's about recognizing that the community is expert within their own experience and that we can all bring something to help the community efforts. And that it's also important to create authentic spaces for innovative solutions and to try new approaches, especially now when we are in the world that we're in and under the regime that we're under. We didn't get to go as much into it, but there are a lot of folks, and I feel like, in the medical space and legal space are probably very similar of like, if something's not broken, don't fix it. And, this is what we've known. And so we are going to do it this way. And people are recognizing that we're going to have to break outside of that in order for us to be able to achieve true justice at this moment where we have people who they're not playing by the traditional rules. And so we have to utilize the people power that we have. We have to utilize, our innovative and our creative juices within us. And that's going to, in a unified approach, will allow for us to be successful. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you again for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. And I hope that you have all found this webinar very useful. Our next webinar will be October 10th at the same time on mental health. And before you leave, we ask you to take a moment to complete the webinar survey if you haven't already. The link is in the chat. This now concludes our session. Thank you, everyone.